So what got me to write this book is I teach a course that I designed when I came to Rutgers University in 1998 as a biophysicist, and I was thrown into a geology department. And I had to very quickly up my level in geology. And I designed a course called History of the Earth System. And what I wanted to do was go from the origin of elements to the evolution of intelligence in 26 lectures. So I do that. But I didn't want to write a textbook. So I wrote a very, very accessible book, which was very hard to write. It was actually the hardest thing I've ever written because it took me 3 years to write 200 pages. Now, when I think about the planet, we call it the blue planet. And the reason it's a blue planet, it's the only planet in our solar system that has liquid water on its surface. Now, surprisingly as it may be, we don't know really where that water came from. So one would think it's pretty obvious you have water on a planet, it must have come from somewhere. We have various competing hypotheses. One of the most popular is it came from importation of water during planetary formation from meteorites, not from comets. This is a very thin film of water. So the average depth of the ocean is about 4,000 meters. But if I were to take all that water and bundle it up into a ball, that's what it would look like. That's the entire volume of the ocean as a sphere. So you see how trivial this is relative to the mass of the planet. Now, it's probable that Mars had liquid water on its surface at one time, but it's no longer there. So a planet is actually very, very, very delicate in terms of its existence, in terms of its physical structure. So Mars doesn't have any liquid water. It's very cold. It has no major atmosphere anymore. That's been blown away. Venus, to the other side of us, closer to the sun, has got approximately 100 times the atmospheric pressure of Earth, and most of that is in the form of carbon dioxide. So there's no water on Venus. So Earth is a very special place. And the water becomes a very special part of the existence of life on this planet, which I'll explain in a bit. Now, the oceans have been around on this planet for a very, very long time. You don't have to be a geologist to realize that these rocks, which are from Greenland and are 3.8 billion years old, have strata in them. And those strata represent sedimentary layers that are now pushed up vertically. So 3.8 billion years ago, there was already liquid water on this planet. In fact, we know there was liquid water on the planet that goes back even before that. There's another thing you see here, in that in the strata, you can see orange stuff, which is rust. So the oceans were precipitating iron, and somehow the iron rusted. Now, you can say, was it rust then? Yes, it looks like there was rust at 3.8 billion years. And that's curious, because we don't think there was oxygen then. So how do you rust something without oxygen? Just keep that in your mind. Let's go on a little bit and see where iron comes from. So this is a very, very famous diagram in geochemistry. This was developed over the lifetime of Victor Goldschmidt, an Austrian Jew who survived the Second World War. And he developed this diagram, which is the distribution of elements based primarily on meteorites. But he actually explained this as being the distribution of elements in our galaxy over time. We came to understand that. And there are two elements here, hydrogen and helium. This is in a log scale, so these abundances are tenfold times. So it's 10, 20, 100, so on. So this is 10 to the 10th fold. So hydrogen and helium are the two most important or most abundant elements in the universe, or in this part of the galaxy, I should say, but almost certainly in the universe. And those were formed in a Big Bang about 13.9 billion years ago. And that's about all that came out of the Big Bang, those two elements. Every other element in this diagram here is the result of an explosion of a very, very hot, very short-lived star. Not like our sun, much, much hotter than our sun. These are supernovae. They live for a very, very short period of time, 500,000 to a few million years. And in it, they produce every other element here. Now, it's sometimes confusing if you even pick up a somewhat technical paper in astrochemistry or astrophysics. The astrophysicists call all of these metals. Obviously, these aren't metals, all of them, but let's just walk down here. There's lithium, beryllium, and boron. You know lithium because it's in our batteries in your computer and your cameras. Lithium is a very, very scarce element because lithium, beryllium, and boron have very delicate nuclei, and in very hot stars, they're destroyed. So only a small fraction remains. But then we come up here, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. Blah, 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 blah. And you see odd, even, odd, even, odd, even. So carbon has 6 protons, nitrogen 7, oxygen 8. So when you have an even number of protons, it's from fusion of helium atoms, which have 2 protons, to make up these elements. And then there's a loss of 1 neutron or a gain of 1 neutron where probability is a little lower. So if you're an even-numbered guy, you're a little bit less abundant than the odd-numbered guys. I mean, if you're an even-numbered guy, you're a little more abundant than the odd-numbered guy in between you. And we walk along, and there's sulfur and phosphorus, and then we see this. There's iron. Iron is a very stable nucleus. It's the most abundant transition element on this planet. That's why it's there. We don't walk around kicking blocks of aluminum in rocks, okay? What you're going to find mostly is iron. And we walk along and walk along and walk along, and we see way out here, there are 2 elements, uranium and thorium. They're naturally radioactive. And those 2 elements, plus potassium-40, are in the center of our Earth, and they generate heat. And that heat engine creates tectonics on the surface of the planet. So these are the building blocks of everything that we see all around us. The physical Earth, the nitrogen in the atmosphere, the oxygen in the atmosphere, the carbon and the oxygen combine to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the hydrogen that used to be in our atmosphere. And there are only 6 elements out of all of those that make up all of life in terms of the macromolecules. The protein, the fats, the sugars, the nucleic acids. And these are what we call the big 6. There's CHNO, so it's hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And if you want to remember them, you could just put the C in front of the H and you have schnapps. Okay? So, in life, as you'll see in a minute, there's an electron transfer reaction, which I'll explain to you, and you will get it. Even if you took chemistry or in high school 70 years ago, you'll get it. Now, let me just explain to you, when we talk about electrons, that means that life is electric. All life is electric. This is not a metaphor. They are generating an electrical field, moving electrons around. So all organisms derive energy for growth by moving electrons from a substrate to a product, and therefore this has to be cycled. And so biological processes are paired. Photosynthesis and respiration. And in the early oceans, it was hydrogen, iron, hydrogen sulfide, and later on it became this cycle. And everybody sort of knows this. We take water, which is on the surface in that thin film in the oceans, we combine it with a little bit of carbon dioxide, and by the magic of light, we convert it into organic stuff, plus this waste product oxygen. Now, you and I can't do that. Only photosynthetic organisms that are green can do that. But we do this. We take that sugar, this candy basically, and we combine it with oxygen and we breathe out these two gases, water and carbon dioxide. So, take a breath. You just reduced oxygen to water. Didn't feel too tough, did it? It doesn't hurt. That was an electrical reaction. You just moved electrons. You just made a whole bunch of energy. But it didn't hurt. So this is fire. This is fire. We just burned sugar, which is really cool. Because you generate these two gases, but you generate energy and you also generated heat. Now, on a global scale, over long times, these two reactions can't be balanced. We have 21% oxygen as part of the Earth's atmosphere today. So 21% by volume. This isn't a trace gas. This is 1/5 of all of the atmospheric volume is this gas, oxygen. So in order to make this stuff, you have to hide the candy from the children, okay? You have to put this in a lockbox. You can't let it all be consumed, otherwise there'd be no oxygen left. And that lockbox, as I'll show you in a minute, is in the lithosphere. It's in rocks, okay? We don't go around eating rocks, and neither do most microbes. All right. Now, today, the source of electrons is this molecule, water. So let's just take a look at this. We went from water, we generated oxygen, we went from this and made a sugar. We took the sugar, we combined it with the oxygen, we made water. The entire world, for the most part, operates on a water-water cycle. Now, for those of you who think that there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, at 21%, that's true. But I don't want to make this an exercise for the high school students in the audience, if you may be one, or for the college students. I'll just tell you, if I collapsed all of that oxygen back into water and I dumped it back into the ocean, the sea level would only rise by 1 meter, about that much. But the production of that is equal to approximately, over a year, 10 to the 7th hydrogen bombs. So you can see that solar energy conversion is incredibly efficient. Now, let's talk about microbes. In 1859, November 24th to be exact, the first edition of The Origin of Species was published by John Murray in London. John Murray was one of the most famous publishers of science texts, and this would be John Murray IV on Albemarle Street. The publisher doesn't exist anymore, but he published many, many very famous texts, including Lyell's text, Principles of Geology. Lyell invented the word geology. So here's what Darwin wrote in Notebook B, which was never published. This was discovered later. Notebook B. He wrote, I think, and then he had this little doodle over here, and he had this idea that there was an organism that later speciated this way and speciated this way and led off to these other different species. Descent with variation followed by a new species, basically. So that was the key concept, ultimately, which was in The Origin of Species. Now, Darwin knew about microbes, but he didn't accommodate them. So what he was thinking about were dogs. And he was thinking about pigeons. He was thinking about beetles. But he wasn't thinking about anything that was a microbe. Now, how did Darwin know about microbes? He had a microscope. And here's the funny thing about science and historical accidents. There was a Dutch fabric seller in Delft named Antoine Leeuwenhoek. And Leeuwenhoek was upper middle class. But he also had a penchant for making stuff with his hands. And he designed a microscope which had a single little round ball lens, which he made. And he never told anybody, even up until his death, how he made these. He pulled, we know, pieces of glass under a flame, then broke it, and made a little ball under the end of the flame, but then somehow he polished them to perfect spheres. Now, the smaller the sphere, the higher the magnification, but the lower the field of view. The larger the sphere, the smaller the magnification, but the larger the field of view. And then he invented this clever little two-plate design where he could mount the sphere here. He could look at it through a sample, which was over here, onto the sun or in a flame, a candle, and he could look at the microbes inside. Now, you have to imagine how crazy this is. It works great if you're nearsighted. If you're presbyopic, you're screwed. You can't see anything, okay? You're going to hold it like that. Now, Leeuwenhoek made 500 of these microscopes in his lifetime. He had several children, only one of which survived, Maria. Maria had nothing to do with this. She wasn't interested in this at all. The microscopes were sold for the price of the metal, and they were made out of silver for the most part, and copper and brass. But they were sold for the price of the metal when Leeuwenhoek died. He had given 12 of them to the Royal Society in London as a gift. He was a foreign member of the Royal Society. The Royal Society had loaned them out, as was the custom of the day, to members of the society. So I proudly went to the Royal Society a few years ago to take a look at Leeuwenhoek's microscope. And the guy comes with white gloves, the librarian, very nice, takes and presents me a box, puts it on the table, gives me white gloves to put on so I can take up this microscope and look at it and handle it and so on. And he says, oh no, don't worry about it too much, I'm very nervous. He says, it's a replica. I said, what do you mean a replica? He says, no, the originals are all gone. They went to members and they never came back. All right, well, within this microscope, Leeuwenhoek discovered that there were small things in natural pond water, for example, that he could see swimming. And he called these animalcules. Now, this is not one of Leeuwenhoek's drawings. I could have put this up, but I really like this drawing because you see this guy here? The microscope allowed him to see these eukaryotic cells, like little algae, like paramecia, things that swim. And he just thought, for the first time, nobody had ever seen these before, he thought these are like little animals. That they have a stomach, they have a little brain, they have little sexual organs. Everything is just like an animal. So that's the beginning of this. And if you go back, you can see these are all online. The Proceedings of the Royal Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which was created by Robert Hooke, was the first scientific journal, and Leeuwenhoek published in there. They're all online. It's amazing, along with a lot of other really interesting papers from the time. All right, in any event, Leeuwenhoek was the first to recognize microbes, and it stopped. He never wrote a textbook. He had no children to carry it on. He was a merchant. He didn't have students. And within the next 50 to 75 years, microbes became irrelevant. Nobody picked it up. It wasn't until the 1830s where microbes were rediscovered in Germany. And that's a very interesting story, but I'm not going to go into it. It's in the book. But the point is this, that even though we had known about microbes for several hundred years, they were ignored. And I'll just point out at this point one thing that was really, really, really brilliant about Leeuwenhoek, just to show you his ingenuity. He scraped his mouth when he was sick one day, and he could see microbes that were bacteria. These were really small things. And he wrote a little paper and he sent it in to the Royal Society, and Hook, who was the editor, thought that Leeuwenhoek finally was crazy. So he sent 10 men, Englishmen, to Delft, and one of them was a vicar. It happened probably that all of them were vicars. Everybody was a vicar. But anyway, they all went to Delft, they all peered down Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and they discovered that these little guys were real. And so that was the discovery of bacteria. Now, what Leeuwenhoek did was he took and scraped his mouth in the morning. They didn't brush their teeth. Okay, he examined how many were there, and then he drank a hot cup of coffee. And then he scraped his mouth again. And he realized that most of the bacteria, or whatever these little guys were gone. And it was the first demonstration that heat could kill microbes. Now, pretty cool. Over the next few hundred years, we discovered that there were fossils of microbes. So this is one from my colleague Andy Knoll at Harvard. This goes back about 1.4 billion years ago. These organisms don't exist in their present form today. But we call them acritarchs, which broadly means we don't know what the hell they are. It's a very fancy word for saying we don't know what the hell they are, okay? Now, many of these probably were algae. And algae produce oxygen. So it's interesting. Keep that in mind. And now let's talk about how do they produce oxygen. So when I was a kid, 8 or 9 years old, I thought somebody knew the answer to everything. I used to go to the Museum of Natural History a lot, and I once went to the planetarium and they were explaining us to, you can't burn stuff without oxygen. That was the original demonstration of the gas. You would burn it, right? Burn a candle, for example, or burn a piece of charcoal. And if it burned, there was oxygen in the room. The word oxygen came from Lavoisier. Oxygen really means acid-loving. But it had been discovered earlier. Nobody knew what it was, but let's think about that. So I always thought that everybody knew how oxygen was made. Well, it turned out to be a little more complicated. I don't want to go through this whole story with you, but basically there's a bunch of proteins that formed from we don't know what. And there are 4 manganese atoms at the end here, which when hit by light, these machines start to move electrons around, and they take the electron ultimately from water, and they make the oxygen. And in every green plant, this electron moves along, and to another reaction center where another beam of light comes in, and ultimately it makes a molecule that goes and fixes carbon dioxide and makes it into a sugar. And this is the structure of that reaction center. So this is a nanomachine. Now this nanomachine, we know in very, very good detail. We don't know where it came from. And let me just show you, if I'm going to flip it for you, so this is one side of the membrane, this is the other side of the membrane. I'm going to turn this and present it to you face on. And there you see 1, 2, 3, 4 manganese atoms. This isn't a drawing. Well, it's a drawing, but it's a drawing based on X-rays. So that's the real position of the manganese atoms. So what am I telling you? There are 4 manganese atoms in every one of the water-splitting complexes of every single organism that makes oxygen on the planet. From a lowly little alga to an oak tree. It's exactly the same. Exactly. There's no evolution here. Nature made this engine once, and it's been used again and again. It made this engine once. It made that engine once. It made this engine once. You and I have this. We have that. All of these were created in microbes. And at the end of the day, the embarrassment here in biology and geochemistry is we don't know where this structure came from. We don't know how this molecule that holds these 4 manganese atoms in position evolved. As my friend Nick Lane calls it, it's the black hole of biology. Now, there are lots of things we don't understand in terms of early evolution of life, but as a kid you would think that everybody knows how water is split. It turns out we don't really understand how water is split very well. Now, at the end of the day, again, those little nanomachines operate on a global scale. They pervaded the planet, first in the oceans, and then later, much later, on land. And so every year you can see a seasonal cycle. As it warms up in the northern hemisphere, it greens. As it gets colder, it ungreens. There are blooms in the ocean, not so many blooms in the ocean depending on the seasons. These are real satellite images that are false color, obviously, but they're satellite images that have been compiled for years. Now, a very, very small fraction of the photosynthetic material that is produced, phytoplankton, for example, which are single-celled algae in the upper ocean, that are produced up here, sink. And most of them are consumed down here by microbes or other things, and a very, 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 very small amount, 0.001% on approximately, will make it into the sediment. And it'll go into the sediment all along continental margins, and that's the sugar. Shallow seas and continental margins, that's what it is. So on geologic timescales, a small fraction of that becomes a fossil fuel, a very small fraction, but most of it is just in sediments as organic stuff. And now I'm going to introduce you to one other thing, which is very cool. So our planet, because of that heat engine, because of those 2 elements, or 3, potassium, fluoride, thorium, and uranium, they produce a heat inside of the planet. So let's just take a look. We're standing on a rock, the North American craton, which seems like it's heavy, but it's actually a light rock. It's a piece of granite. You can think of it this way. And the ocean has this very thin rock, basalt. So if I put a candle under this light rock that's floating, but it's thick, this rock starts to fracture. And it breaks up, and it'll go into 2 different directions. So one will go that way, one will go that way. And as it goes this way and that way, it fills in where the ocean will be between the 2 continents now with basalt making an ocean plate. And so here you see the basalt filling in, and you have this mid-ocean ridge where the volcanic heat is coming up. Now you would think, or I would think, this is where we are now. This is the North Atlantic Ocean. This is the Atlantic Ocean in general. This is what the Atlantic Ocean is like. You would think that California in a few 100 million years is going to smack into China. No. It's going to be more like New York is going back to France. So what happens is, as we move along here and get more and more distance, these bits of basalt get colder and colder and colder, and they start to subduct. And that's when you get earthquakes. But they start to shave off bits of continental margin, and they lift it up onto the craton. So these bits of stuff that is lifted up onto the craton they have organic matter in it. And there's an example of black shales that's about 200 million years old that's been lifted up and put onto the craton. And if we didn't have that process, you and I wouldn't be breathing oxygen. So it's not just making the machine in biology that allowed the oxygen to be produced in the first place. It's removing the sugar and putting it in the lockbox and getting it away from guys that can eat it. So Bas, my postdoc here, is not going over to have lunch with the rocks. Okay. Now, this is, just look at the top one. This is the only thing you need to know. We had what we call a great oxidation event, which is a euphemism. So euphemism meaning we maybe got to 1% of the present atmospheric value of oxygen about 2.4, 2.3 billion years ago. And then it was pretty low. And then we got to about 700 million years ago, and it went up to roughly 10%. And then it's been between 10 and 30% ever since. And this little bump up here, see that little bump where it goes really high? That's the rise of trees. All right, so during the Carboniferous, 400 million years ago approximately, it was 35% oxygen. We had, and we have fossils of this, dragonflies with wingspans of a meter. Okay. Now, that was the last major evolutionary event on the planet, the rise of oxygen. Everything else became relatively simple. Organisms started to use oxygen as a way to dump electrons and get a lot of energy. They supercharge their engines, that's what we do. And that's what Escherichia coli, the bacteria, does. In fact, as one eukaryote talking to another, we're not that different from E. coli, okay? I just want you to think about it. You know, we sing and we dance and we watch television. I don't think E. coli does that, but they have their other stuff that they do that we can't. All right, so look. A few years ago, I worked with my friend Tom Fenchel and Ed DeLong, and I said, guys, this is nuts. Well, let's just put together a wiring diagram of the planet. Let's just wire up the planet. So this is a wiring diagram. This is all the major metabolisms of everything on Earth. 90% of this stuff is microbial. We can't do most of this stuff. We're very limited. But microbes can do many, many things here that we can't do. And most of this is not because of oxygen. It's actually in the absence of oxygen. This evolved really early in Earth's history. So I said, look, okay, how complicated is this stuff? And it turns out there are only about 400 genes responsible for all the electron transport reactions on the planet. That shouldn't be too hard to figure out. So let's think about this. I think about this literally as a planet with a circuit board. So what's the power supply? The power supply is the sun. What are the wires? So you and I are sitting in this room right now. We're breathing oxygen. We're not making oxygen in the room. You didn't come in with a whole bunch of algae on your back, and you don't need a little light. You don't need to stand like this in front of the light to get your oxygen, right? It's probably not happening today that you got the oxygen from Washington, D.C. The oxygen has been transported to you courtesy of the atmosphere from distant places. It could have been produced in Africa 1,000 years ago. And it's all mixed. So that's one wire. The other wire is the ocean. So you have one power supply and two wires. Not too hard. This is really not bad. I mean, you know, we're talking about electronics here. It's not too bad. So you have one wire, one power supply, two wires, and maybe 400 transistors on this board. We should be able to figure this out, right? So let's think about how that works. So there are metals in biology. Those are what is actually helping to move the electrons around. And most of the metals are iron. So the most abundant transition metal turns out to be the most important in biology. And you know you need a lot of iron because you use that to transport oxygen in your blood. Your hemoglobin requires oxygen. But you have oxygen, requires iron. There's iron in the mitochondria. There's iron that you need for many, many electron transport reactions. And those iron molecules come in various flavors, but simple structures. So this is an example of one of those structures, an iron, 4 irons and 4 sulfurs, in a very simple molecule, which is ferredoxin, which you and I have, and which virtually every organism on the planet has. And here's another one. This is the enzyme that fixes nitrogen, takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and makes ammonia. Without this, life would cease. It was invented once. It's an iron-sulfur cluster system. Again, iron-sulfur, 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 iron-sulfur. You can see nature tinkered with iron-sulfur clusters and made iron-sulfur clusters the core of the transistors on the planet. And here's another one where we take another metal, this happens to be copper, or another one where we have just manganese. So we use a certain number of metals, very simple number of metals. We don't use many transition metals. We don't use, for example, we don't use gallium, iridium. We're not using aluminum. Okay? So about 70% of all the electron transfers on the planet are based on iron, really abundant. Copper is next, and then manganese, nickel, molybdenum, and a little bit of vanadium and cobalt. And the rest are relatively trivial. So it turns out that of all those structural motifs in the proteins, there are really only 35 patterns. So you don't have 400 patterns, you only have 35. So I'm going to give you a box, an electronic box, okay? You go to the toy store, you're going to build a radio, you want to build the world. So here's the box. It's going to have a power supply, you're going to take out the sun. Okay, you got your light. You got your light bulb, okay? You're going to take out 2 wires. One is going to be the air, the other is going to be the water. And then you're going to take out 35 transistors. That's it. It shouldn't be too hard to reverse engineer the evolution of life. Now, I'm working on it. So I had a very clever graduate student, and we went through the structures of all the major proteins on the planet for which we have structures, and we have most of the structures. And I said, let's do a very simple diagram of arraying them from the most simple to the most complex. And so this is not based on the amino acid sequence, it's based on structure, on shape. Really simple shape, a little hand, 3 hands. Okay, so if I have a hand, and I have 2 hands, and I have 3 hands, they evolved from 1 hand that was gene duplicated to make 2 hands. To make 3 hands, right? So those are all an array. So the first guy is 1 hand, then you have 2 hands, then 3 hands. You get the idea? All right. So the first simplest hand is that very simple iron-sulfur cluster ferredoxin. The original one contained only 28 amino acids. And I can take and I can just make a little bit of embellishment on that, just a really little bit of an embellishment. And all of a sudden, I can make something that does magic. I can split hydrogen into protons and electrons. And when you see this way back here, you know that life almost certainly began fueled by hydrogen gas on this planet. It still exists, but it's very rare. And then we can walk out and you can see all these other metabolisms until you get way out here. This is one of the very last metabolisms to evolve. This is cytochrome C. And that's the protein in our bodies that allows us to transfer the electrons to oxygen to make water. And that guy contains copper. Okay? So this is the array of metabolism and its evolutionary history without dates. Without dates. I don't know the dates. I could make up dates, but somebody would call me a liar. Now, I'm going to finish this up by talking a little bit about light. So at the top of the atmosphere, this is the energy of the sun. And these lines are real lines. These are lines from the sun where it is absorbing light. They're called Fraunhofer lines. I don't want to go into it, but these are real. This is not noise. So at the top of the atmosphere, this is the sunshine falling on the Earth today. And you can see this is very hard ultraviolet light, which we don't get too much of on the surface of the planet today. And then this is infrared light, which is kind of not interesting, except it keeps the planet warm. But the point is here. You see this? This is blocked out at the surface of the planet. See this? Really, really, very, very little ultraviolet light hits the surface of the planet. Why? Why? We made ozone. In order to make ozone, you need oxygen. So, when the ozone was created, it blocked out the ultraviolet light. But before the ozone was created, before there was oxygen on the planet, which I showed you was the great oxidation event of about 2.4 billion years, the Earth is 4.5 billion years. From 4.5 billion years to 2.4 billion years, there was a lot of UV light shining on the planet, hitting the surface. Okay, Paul, so what's the problem? Why is that interesting? Well, let's just take a little molecule here. So this is iron carbonate. So you know calcium carbonate is chalk. You've probably taken a Tums for your tummy at some point in your life. That's a magnesium carbonate. But calcium carbonate is, you know, we used to have chalkboards where you could actually write with chalk on a piece of slate. Okay, remember that material? Okay, so that's calcium carbonate. This is iron carbonate. Iron carbonate was produced a lot before there was oxygen. It's very unstable in the presence of oxygen. It's called siderite. I don't know why mineralogists do this. Mineralogists have 5,000 friggin' minerals, and they give them all a name. How are you supposed to remember that? I don't know. No. Anyway, this is siderite. And siderite, all I'm doing here, or my former student John Kim did, is he took siderite and he exposed it to ultraviolet light. And this is an example of what happens. You burn it, and you see this is, I don't know, the lights are on too high, but this is orange. We oxidized the iron to iron 3. We made rust. With just light, no oxygen. Just light. I took the energy of an ultraviolet light and I popped an electron out of this iron and I made it into rust. Now, if you're a chemist, you say, okay, Paul, what happened to the electron? Where did it go? It made hydrogen. The surface of this planet was flooded with hydrogen gas for 2 billion years, just from the energy of the sun supplying the gas. And now you can see the dance. You have a great, great source of electrons to reduce carbon dioxide to make a sugar, to make candy. Organisms now can access this with a simple molecule which contains an iron-sulfur cluster, and they can take that hydrogen gas, break it up into protons and electrons, and use it to reduce the carbon dioxide to make the sugar. The very beginning of life on this planet. Now, the chemistry is a little complicated, and I don't want to bother you with it, but I just want you to understand that you can oxidize the iron, which I showed you from 3.8 billion years ago, with no oxygen. You can make rust just with light. No bugs. Now, I'm going to end this because there are young people in the audience, and you will live to see this before maybe I will, although I hope I live long enough. This was an artist's conception of the terrestrial planet finder, which did not make it through the decadal review last time, in NASA's decadal review. It's a very risky type of maneuver to be set. So let me tell you what we're going to do. So you do remember, just a few weeks ago, we discovered gravity waves using 2 interferometers, right? So an interferometer is a mechanism by which light can null each other out in a wavelength and blacken out the background. So the 2 waveforms come together and they cancel each other out in light space, and it's dark. All right, so this is an interferometer that would be flown in space, and it'd be flown at the Lagrangian 2 point. So the L2 point is a place which is equigravitationally distant between the Earth and the Moon. A very stable place. Now, the trick is these guys have to fly in formation, perfect formation. A few millimeters and the interferometer doesn't work. And they're staring out 5, 6, 8 parsecs away at planets, at the dark side of the planet. Now, if you looked at the dark side of Earth from space, it wouldn't be dark. It'd be quite bright in the infrared. Right? Quite bright, because it's hot. It's a light bulb. Now, if it was a perfect black body, it would just be a light bulb that would have no information to it. But as the light goes from the surface of the planet out through the atmosphere, some of those photons are absorbed by the gases in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide, for example, or nitrous oxide, or methane. And you can stare at this planet using that technique and determine the planetary gas composition. So the terrestrial planet finder was designed to look at planets not in our solar system, but in exosolar planets to try to figure out their gas composition. So let me tell you, the trick here is that every organism on Earth that is alive exchanges a gas with its environment. You remember those old Hollywood movies where the guy would be shot in the Western and somebody would come over to him and feel whether or not he's breathing. If he wasn't breathing, he's dead. It's obvious. If you're not breathing, you're dead. Well, the same thing is true of a microbe. If it's not breathing, it's dead. Okay? Or can be revived, maybe, if you stick it in some water, but most of the time they're dead. So, even seeds breathe. So if organisms are exchanging gases with their environment, they can potentially alter the atmospheric gas composition of a planet that you'll never be able to see. Physically, you'll never be able to get there. So let's think about this for a second now. If you were to say, is there life on Earth? And I just showed you oxygen. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. You cannot make oxygen on this planet or any other mechanism that we know of without an organism. No oxygen is made just by light, or trivial amounts. So that's the no-brainer. But supposing it's more subtle. Supposing I'm in the first 2.5 billion years of this planet's history. There's no oxygen, or very little. But I see methane and nitrous oxide. That's laughing gas. N2O. Those two gases are very far apart from each other in what we call redox space. They're formed by 2 very different processes. It's virtually impossible for us to envision their coexistence without microbial life. So that is what we're trying to do in searching for life on extrasolar terrestrial planets within the habitable zone. That means within the zone in which there is liquid water potentially on the surface. And it's a very, very interesting area that's rich for discovery. We don't use this mechanism anymore. We use other mechanisms that astronomers have access to now because of different telescopes and because this was killed. But basically, we're looking for glows from other planets that inform us about the potential for life outside of Earth. And the rationale here, as I said, is every organism that we know of and all life that we can conceivably think about has to be exchanging a gas with its environment. That's the rationale. So it's not just follow the water, it's follow the gases. And it's a little more subtle than just following the water. So anyway, I'm going to finalize this. Basically, the first 2.5 billion years of Earth's history, what I call the research and development phase. Okay? So this was a time when Silicon Valley of nature was fiddling around and trying to make devices. Some failed. The failures we don't see. Some succeeded. And from that, it developed a relatively small core set of genes. Very small. So let's put it this way. You and I are not that different in our metabolism than an E. coli. I just told you that. But we have genes for vision, we have genes for other things. Actually, we have 25,000 or so genes. It's like buying a Mercedes-Benz or buying a small Vespa. Okay? They're running on the same basic principle of an internal combustion engine. So the engines for the life are the same. But you put it in different body forms. So, you know, one is big and shiny and black and has a lot of stuff, chrome, and the other is stripped down, 2 wheels, but it's the same basic design principle in terms of what it makes it to go. So nature's engines are highly, highly, highly conserved. Basically, it is just different body forms that, by the by, are totally expendable. You come and go with body forms. We don't see dinosaurs walking around today, except for birds, which are dinosaurs. So you know T-Rex tasted like chicken. But the point is that dinosaurs had exactly the same machinery as a microbe that was evolved 2 billion years before it. And we have the same machinery as a dinosaur. All right. All of these processes were developed in prokaryotes. That means organisms that are really, really, really old, like bacteria. All of them. You and I and the oak trees and dogs and cats and dinosaurs and birds and snakes and fishes and snails and oysters and worms and corals didn't invent anything. We all stole it. Okay, this was basically just taken from prokaryotes and incorporated into different body forms. There are only 400 genes, as I told you, and these sequences are coupled on local and planetary scales. That's the really important thing. That wiring diagram I told you about, that's not for an individual bug, that's for the planet. Organisms are communicating with each other across the planet. You're breathing out carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide will be consumed by a photosynthetic organism, you know, possibly in Latin America in 200 years. And the entire driving force for the surface of this planet is our star. I just want to thank some of my funders. The first part of this was really developed by others, but the latter part with this was developed with a lot of support by the Moore Foundation. And then my partners in crime usually are Vic Nanda and Dave Case, who really know electronics of proteins. And I just want to say thank you very, very much for your attention.